Hello, welcome to our third installment in our off-season webinar series on how to leverage analytics. I'm Morgan Flum, CEO of Pivot Analysis, and today I'll be going through a workflow on how you can use some of our metrics or general team analytics in analyzing teams for scheduling purposes. So we'll be relying once again on those documents located on our cheat sheets page. So the percentiles by team and the season reviews. And these give you a really good idea on the correlation side of what metrics we think are undervalued and maybe useful for finding those teams that underperformed or overperformed last year. And then the percentiles being a great way to quickly review at the team level full metrics. And then once again, using our application to dig in a little bit deeper and start to have a pretty good grasp on how the team actually functions and what their rotations and roster looks like. So we'll be going through a workflow initially on finding a team in a certain conference, and then working from there to analyze how teams should be valued and which team may be the most appropriate for maximizing strength of schedule. So once again, it's the correlation document. So the cheat sheets and the percentiles are all here. So I recommend that you download those before you doing the workflows that we've prescribed. So we're going to start with the women's side and say that we're a team and trying to find an opponent in the Big Sky Conference, and we're looking to find someone that may be potentially undervalued. So we've got two clear teams at the top, and then a group of 5 teams in the middle here, all above 500, but none of them with a particularly strong schedule. So we want to pick out which of these may be the best. I mean, Idaho State has the best record in conference, but we want to know what the metrics say, and so we can start to make some decisions about that. So I pulled up the Big Sky Conference in the percentiles rank, and this tells a more clear story about these teams and how they perform. So we still have a clear delineation at the top. So a net rating is a really good metric for understanding overall performance, especially when you compare it to winning percentage, which may have a little bit of noise baked into it. The net rating tends to be a more stable metric. So Montana State and Idaho are the clear 2 top teams, but then Idaho State actually is a clear third, because you've got a gap of 4 between them and Montana, and then 4 points between Montana and Portland State. So there's pretty clear tiers here. And so identifying Idaho State as the significantly better team is fairly straightforward using this approach. So we can do a couple other things to kind of validate these metrics. So net rating, offensive defensive rating, being the top level efficiency, points per possession, points allowed per possession, are really good metrics to focus on. But the 4 factors can also be pretty illuminating in terms of their predictive value. And we put them here basically in order of their importance. So EFG always being the most important. Rebounding and turnovers can be back and forth a little bit, but they're usually about the same level of importance, and the free throw rate being the least important. So EFG actually tells us that Idaho State could be even better next year, assuming that the players they have on the roster will be on the team next year. So that's something we'll check in a minute. But their net EFG is the highest in the conference, and that is far and away the most important indicator below points per possession of a team being a good team. So this is an indication that they might even be the second best team going into next season. So it's important to kind of check all of these other metrics. Not only does it give you an idea on how good that team actually was, but you can start to understand a little bit in terms of where a certain conference tends to focus and what the scheme of a team might be. So the 4 factors, we broke them out by team and opponent as well. So we can see that Idaho State is really good on both ends on EFG. It's not like they're just good on offense or just good on defense. So that net is generated because they're pretty good on both ends of the ball. Offensive rebounding, middle of the road. Turnover, middle of the road. Free throw rate is pretty low on both ends. But seeing as how that's the least important of the four factors, that's something that obviously is not going to play as big of a role as the effective field goal percentage. So if we want to dig in a little bit on what that EFG looks like and make sure that there wasn't something completely unsustainable, we can look at some of the percentages by these locations. So field goal percentage at the rim and allowed at the rim, both pretty good numbers, pretty reasonable. And same with the proportions. So they actually have a pretty good percentages, but the proportions are not as good. Pretty standard across the mid-range. And then on the three-point side, they were a very good three-point shooting team. So the best three-point shooting team in this conference. So that's another pretty good indicator of success, especially on the offensive side, is three-point accuracy. And then on the opponent side, and this might be an area where they're getting a little bit lucky because this is 2 percentage points lower than anybody else in the conference. So maybe they're playing good three-point defense. Maybe there's a little bit of luck, but that's something to keep in mind when evaluating their defensive EFG. And then the last thing that's important for looking at whether a team was lucky or not is the free throw percentage. So especially on the opponent side, and Idaho State was actually unlucky. So they allowed one of the highest opponent free throw percentages. So 22nd percentile overall, 30th opponent adjusted. So not a lucky team, slightly unlucky on the free throw side. So that's a good validation of the overall efficiency, because we can make sure that they didn't allow opponents to shoot like 60% from the free throw line, in which case you'd know that there was a good deal of luck on that, and so their points per possession should actually be a lot higher on the defensive side. So going from here, we want to check on whether this team is returning as players. So I pulled up their roster on the NCAA site and quickly be able to see, the years and if there's any seniors. So we have a little bit of an inkling that the primary drivers of this team are the underclassmen. There's actually only one senior on the roster. So another good indicator for their future performance. And then we can dig in a little bit on the app side here. So pulling it up and starting to drill in a little bit on the performance. So this is going to be a really good way for starting to understand how this team performs. And fortunately, we know that it's really only this one player who's going to be gone. So it makes the future analysis a little bit more straightforward for a team that has a lot of roster turnover. This can be a lot more complex and honestly a lot harder to predict. But if it's one player who didn't play that much who's leaving, then the year over year expectations should be pretty stable. And so we're able to see, isolated to just possessions without the senior, how did the team perform and what was happening in terms of shot profile. So we have the 4 factors in the shot profile. And all of this really goes to back up the fact that even though they were 18 and 13, we think this team is probably a lot better than that. Definitely they have the makings of a team that could potentially even win the conference next year. So being able to spot these teams that maybe have a middling win-loss record, but once you dig in a little bit and then look at the net rating and the net EFG and some of the underlying factors, especially if there's pretty good roster continuity, it becomes a lot easier to project some development from that team. And so maximizing that strength of schedule by finding some of these teams that may have been young in 2019, 2020, but will be better this coming season. This is a good method to start going down that path. So I did some similar analysis on the men's side. So I wanted to look at a handful of teams in the 300s and say, okay, we know that these teams were all pretty low on the win-loss side, but how do they actually look in our data? So I pulled up NJIT, UT Martin, and Stanford. So they all were basically the same record, same win-loss. But when we look at them in our data, there's a massive difference in terms of net rating, and then smaller differences in some of the other metrics. So this is where being able to go in and say, okay, maybe this is not as stark in terms of net EFG, but this team does a couple things well. Is this sustainable? And do we expect that they're going to be improving from last year? Also leveraging what we know of the roster and how we project this to look going forward. So I pulled up the NGIT roster so we can start to see, okay, the players that are leaving, were they the most important players? So we have a couple seniors, Riley Walsh and Shaquan Gibbs. How are they actually affecting the team? So the on-off metrics, so I didn't use this on the women's side because there's only losing that one player who's a lower rotation player. But when we want to analyze a team that's losing a couple, maybe higher, heavy rotation players, we want to pull it up here. And so it's pretty easy to get an idea in terms of overall impact at the season level, how the team performed in those scenarios. And so of the starting five, or of the top five, the seniors were actually the worst in terms of on-court impact. So obviously the rest of the bench players were not as good, but if you're replacing, well, two of the three worst, Zach Cooks, I guess, is a little lower, but he also had significant on-off metrics in terms of the drop-off when he was on the bench. So looking at the on-off differential, if you're replacing the worst two on the on-off differential, there should be some opportunity for growth. And so this is a picture that we may expect some improvement, especially if all these players are returning. And looking at the stats quick can give you an idea in terms of offensive load, what these players were putting in. So in terms of scoring, they were not particularly heavy. In terms of rebounding, assists, turnovers as well. And then on the rate side, we can look at the efficiency numbers and see what's being lost. Looked at the points per shot, and then the usage is also really important for just gauging who's running the offense. And so all the players with the above 20 usage will be returning. So that's another good indicator that, at least on the offensive side, what's being lost is not this significant creation. Maybe it's some off-ball work, but again, these players were not particularly efficient. So being able to kind of put the pieces together and then say, okay, although NGIT struggled, we think that this net rating will improve going into next year because the players that are staying were actually the most important ones. They were the highest usage ones. So you may see some slight improvement in these other metrics because you're returning your best players. And then being able to drill in a little bit on the lineup side and understand what actually happened when the seniors were coming on and off and how that was affecting. So we know overall performance, but how it was affecting the four factors, and the shooting profile is going to be very instrumental in giving you a picture of how the team might perform going forward, particularly assuming that there's some development on the younger players who are continuing to progress. So I think that the main takeaway from today's session is really to identify what the objective is for your analysis. So if you're trying to find the most undervalued or overvalued team, maybe then it's just compiling everything from a win-loss perspective and comparing it to what we have on the percentile side and seeing what the ones with the biggest gap are. Or if you're comparing a handful of teams, you pick out a conference you want to play someone from, or just you want to play, one of the teams that was ranked 350 through 325 and find the one that's got the highest upside there or the lowest upside. Really depends on what your objective is. Being able to quickly pluck those teams out, punch them into the spreadsheet here, see how they compare to their peers, see whether or not we think that they under or overperform based on their net rating or some of these other fundamentals, and then drill in a little bit on the lineup side and see what's actually happening to the team when the seniors or the transfers are leaving. And then based on last week's session, if you want to analyze a team that's bringing in some transfers, trying to model that and say, okay, last week we talked about BYU. What do they look like with Matt Harms? How is that affecting this team? And trying to analyze some of those impacts relative to the previous team baseline. So once again, I encourage everyone to sign up for the trial on our site and get access to the web app. And then as always, go to the cheat sheet site and start to pull down those documents. And they'll be very useful for trying to frame some of your analysis. Thanks. Have a great weekend. Bye.